Hi, welcome to part 2 of shooting YouTube videos. If you're here for the model railways, then I'm afraid this is going to be purely about shooting videos, so hopefully I'll see you next week when we'll continue with the bridge structure that's behind me. Last week's video, which should be appearing up here, gave you a basic intro into shooting video for YouTube. So where do we go from here? Well, I think the best thing to start this week is on the basics. So most cameras are basically split into two categories, and they shoot either PAL, known as PAL, get away, or nTSC. Now this is based upon where you are in the world. Now on this image you can see that there are sort of three main areas. There's the nTSC, which tends to be stateside and down in South America. There's the PAL region, which is mainly around Europe and some of Africa, and also a CCAM area. And for the purposes of this, PAL and CCAM are exactly the same. So what's the difference between these two areas? Well, it all stems, I believe, from the frequency of power in these two areas. And if you're at 60 Hertz, then you're on nTSC, and if you're on 50 Hertz, then you're known as a PAL region. And the reason why these differences occur then in cameras is because you'll end up with flickering should you be selecting the wrong region. So you'll end up shooting with nTSC, you tend to shoot at either 24, 30 or 60 frames per second. And if you have 60 Hertz, then there isn't a problem. Whereas in this country we have 50 Hertz, and therefore we need to shoot at 25 or 50 frames per second. That's the PAL answer. Now some people would maintain that it doesn't make any difference whether you shoot on PAL or nTSC, and the fact that nTSC is obviously the American format, it might be better for YouTube. Well, I can find no truth in this. I'm in the UK, so I naturally shoot on PAL at 25 frames per second. Some people maintain that it makes no difference. Well, it does in certain cases, and it's hard to prejudge the sort of lights that you're working with until you're working through your video in post. And here are a couple of examples. So this model railway guy, known as Cheeky Tech, has done some work on his model shunter, and it runs around his layout and looks rather nice. However, when you look into the little shed, you can see the lights pulsing. And similarly here on my own little layout of Chadwick TMD, as the train goes towards the loco shed, you can see the lights in the loco shed that are pulsing too. So if you get this right from the start, then it won't really matter. So hopefully from those two examples you can see that something was wrong, and clearly it was the frame rate compared to the region selected, and they were both shot at 60 frames per second, yet pushed through on a PAL region's settings, hence the pulsing. So what else can you get wrong? Well, I've explained about frames per second, so what you could do now is you could still select the wrong frames per second and put it onto a PAL timeline. So let's say you're running on a 25 frames per second timeline, and like Paul from Sandling Junction, though it used to be known as No Name Junction at this time, it was shot in August 2018, he shot it at 24 frames per second, which is actually 23.95, but we won't go there. So he shot it at a US 24 frames per second and dropped it on a UK 25 frames per second timeline. Yeah, I even get confused myself here. So what's the result? Well, hopefully you can see here that every now and again you see a stutter, and that's caused by the program itself making up that one missing frame, so it tends to kind of stutter or jump and you don't get a smooth output. So it's a straightforward issue. Once I spotted it on his channel, I dropped him an email, and he agreed what he was doing wrong, put it right, and he's kind of lived happily ever after. And his channel, Sandling Junction, needs a bit more support, and if you would mind subscribing to it, I'm sure it would do him some good, because he is a very good modeller whose skills are clearly coming on well, and he's developing quite an exciting little railway in his garage. Invariably, there are more complications to come, and now we talk about shutter speeds. Now, there is something called a 180-degree rule, and all you need to remember is that if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you need a shutter speed of at least double it. So if it's 25 frames per second, you need a shutter speed of at least 1/50th of a second. If you're in the States, then you're on a 30 frames per second, then you need at least a 60th. In the UK, if you're on a 50th, you'll need a 100th of a second, or perhaps 125th of a second. You can go over, though you do get a strange effect, but you mustn't go under double your frame rate, if that makes sense. So I'll just run through that again. If you're shooting at 25 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be set to at least 1/50th of a second. And let's say you're in the States, when you're shooting at a 30th of a second, then you need a shutter speed of at least 1/60th. And that doubling is known as the 180-degree rule. To take that onwards, if you not only double it, but go, sort of not necessarily ridiculously over the top, then you get something called a staccato effect, so that when the engine runs along, it doesn't give like a blurred cinematic motion, but it actually gives a stuttery kind of picture. And that's because, getting back to 25 frames per second, what you're looking at is obviously every second you see 25 single frames. But those 25 frames, as the motion runs through, they're all slightly blurred, so you get this smooth cinematic feel. Unless, of course, you're panning with your subject, in which case your subject stays sharp and your background blurs in that cinematic feel. But if you're shooting, as I have here, at, I think it was 1/1600th of a second, and this is a DMU down in Cornwall, then you get this staccato effect, and hopefully you can see that it sort of pulses as you go along. You can see the actual frames. And if I freeze the frame and stop it dead, there is no blur, and you can actually read the number of this DMU. Hopefully I haven't lost you yet. Here's a local viaduct which I filmed with my drone, and if I freeze it, then you can easily read the GWR on the front tractor unit, and that's because I'm panning the drone along with the motion of the HST. A little bit later I stop panning, and if I freeze this frame, then trying to read First Great Western on the coaches, it's quite blurred, whereas the viaduct remains pin sharp. And that's the effect you get when you've got the correct shutter speed with the correct frame rate. It's cinematic, it looks good, and it kind of works. So hopefully you're still with me and your minds haven't exploded. One other thing I thought I'd touch on today is time-lapse. Now, I do time-lapses quite regularly in my videos, and the time-lapses are normally made up of single images that are just played together at 25 frames per second, and so you see me putting the back scene up or sawing up timber or whatever I might be doing. There's also another way of doing it, and that you just shoot the video and then you change the speed of which it plays back. And here are two sequences that I shot in Paddington a week or so ago. So you can tell which one's which. This one, the first one here, is the time lapse. All very good. And this second one is the speed ramping. You may have a preference, I don't know. I kind of like time lapses, but other people would rather see the blurred motion. But before you shoot the one you intend to speed up, just remember how big these file sizes are, because the time lapse, which is the single images, is 27 megabytes. whereas the other sequence I've ramped up is 468 megs, so it is 20 times bigger. And if storage capacity on your computer is an issue, or computer power is an issue, then you really ought to avoid doing the kind of speed up ones. Just stick with the time lapses, if of course your camera can do that. But then we were getting back to camera choice again, and you ought to be choosing a camera that not only does videos, but it can take stills, and therefore it can do time lapses. But just another aspect to think about before you make any real hefty purchases. I thought I'd have a little chat about microphones. I use a lapel mic, and if you might think that's a very expensive thing to do because you need a transmitter and receiver, then you'd be right. I actually bought it for a Kingfisher project where I wanted to listen to what was going on inside the nest, so I could video it from across the river and listen to what was going on. And if you're wondering, yes, I did have a Schedule 1 license to do so because you could cause disturbance at the nest. So a lapel mic, but how cheap are they? Well, they are quite reasonably priced, and you don't need the transmitter pack or whatever. All you need is a cable to go from the microphone to your camera or to your phone or whatever. If you're interested in buying one, they're in the See More tab below, but a word of caution is you will obviously need to buy a cable to go from this lead, because it's only about sort of 3 foot long, off to your camera or to your phone. And if you've got an iPhone, you certainly need a different type of cable, because I think there's a 3-segment input into an iPhone rather than other phones. But you'll have to do your homework on what cable you need, and if it's going straight into a camera, then I'm sure there's no problems at all. And it's the sort of thing you used to be able to buy at Maplin's. Sadly that's gone, but I'm sure any sort of decent shop can sort you out, and you can figure it out quite straightforward for yourselves, I'm sure. Microphones, that's what I like. One problem with it is if I talk down, it tends to get louder, so you just have to be aware of where you put your head. Great. Next thing I'd like to talk about is camera prices. Camera prices have something called a diminishing return. So the more you spend, I believe, is the less you get. This is a GoPro Hero, I think it's a 3, is it? A GoPro Hero 3 Plus. It's no big deal. It was a couple £100 when I bought it, and I think it's probably 4 or 5 years old. But for filming general stuff, including model railway layouts or whatever your bag might be, this works perfectly well as long as you can hold it steady. Of course, it has appalling video, so you might need to buy something I would believe called a Zoom H1. Zoom H1, yeah, I think it is. There'll be a link below. Don't go and buy the Zoom H5, because that's just, it's a couple £100 and you don't really need to go to that. All you need to be able to do is have a decent video and decent audio, and if you don't buy it in a compact camera that all comes in a oneer, then you'll need to stitch them together in post-production with your software package. So these are the sort of cameras that you might choose to start out with. So I said about diminishing returns. I was never a great art student, as you can probably tell. Video cameras, diminishing returns, pounds against quality. So how does it work? Well, if you've got your kind of ordinary camera and you've paid £100 or £200 for it, and then the quality is quite reasonable. So it comes along the quality graph some distance, okay? And most video cameras, mobile phones and the rest of it are good. And as I mentioned, this perhaps GoPro is in this category, as is my old iPhone. So we're around the couple of £100 mark, really. Now, the more you spend, you'd like to think that this is a straight line graph. So the more you spend, the quality, I'll say that was the quality there, and then the quality here would go up. So if I spend £500, then you get a better camera. If you spend £1,000, you'll get an even better camera, and something like that. But if you spend a huge amount of money, then it all goes to rats, because you've spent a great deal of money, but the quality has hardly moved. So spend with care, because this isn't a straight line graph. The more you spend isn't necessarily the more you get. In the first video in this series, I mentioned about software packages and I made a couple of mistakes. I think I mentioned that Final Cut Pro 10 doesn't give you free upgrades. It does, and there's also various other applications that are free that I failed to mention. I'm sorry, it was my mistake entirely, and I take it on the nose. But now it's over to you, because what I would like you to do is, in the comments section, is turn around. If you feel strongly about anything I've said, or you think I've made a mistake, then please mention it. But I'd ask you to read through the comments, because other people are putting, I'd like them to put down there the cameras that they use if they recommend them, or the cameras they use and they don't recommend them, so we get a better body of work, as it were, of what everyone's using. So if you're using Final Cut 10 and it's brilliant, then please say so. If you're using Final Cut 6 or whatever and it's pants, then say so. Because there's no way I can recommend things that I don't use. I use Adobe Premiere Pro. I think it's brilliant, but then it does cost me £19, whatever it is, per month. So it had better be brilliant, to be perfectly honest. It's a kind of pro spec item, so you expect pro spec results. I can barely speak with my hay fever. So what I would ask you to do, as I mentioned, is list your camera gear that you recommend. If you don't recommend it, you feel quite strongly about it, then again, list that. And if you, the viewer, haven't got any gear, perhaps you'd like to read through it, and there may be some good tips there to help you on your way to choosing the right gear for you. As I've mentioned in the past, I mean, this GoPro or these type of action cameras are quite good, and if you use a Zoom H1 to record your video and you have the facility to put the two together, then it's great to go, because you can do all your filming with your GoPro and then you can do your audio afterwards on the timeline. So it's just a case of viewing it on the screen. As it comes along, you'll talk about this bit or that bit and so on and so forth. And if you're not doing a piece to camera, it works well. If you are doing a piece to camera, you just need to get the synchronization of the audio and the visual spot on. Otherwise you'll find, obviously, it goes out of sync and all looks a bit odd. There we go. This kind of wraps it up for today. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment, as I mentioned, for the other people in the other viewers and are thinking of getting into video, so they can learn from your good and your bad decisions. And I'll be back to you at the end of this week with another model railway video, and hopefully in a week or two with another video, if that makes sense. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.